You are listening to a Clarkesworld Magazine podcast with your host and narrator, Kate Baker. Greetings, Clarksville citizens. I want to thank you for spending the time with us by showing up and listening to yet another podcast. I know your time is precious, but it does offer an escape. It invites you to new worlds, meets new characters, and it's all thanks to you. So, if you've gone to patreon.com/Clarksworld, clarksvillecitizens.com, subscribe to the magazine, chucked us a few bucks via a donation, I just want to thank you and say we cannot do this without you. Your contribution, just by being here and listening, telling a friend about the magazine, allows us to grow, allows us to pay our artists, our nonfiction contributors, our authors, and our staff. So thank you. Our story for today is a 4-story for the month of October 2025, issue 229. It's titled Understudies and is by Greg Egan. And Greg Egan is an Australian science fiction writer. His latest books are the novel Morphotrophic and the collection Sleep in the Soul. And if you like what you hear, you can go back to Dream Factory and You and Whose Army. So, my dear listener, I hope that you can sit back, relax, and let me tell you a story. One. It's completely up to you whether you want to go ahead with this, Vince's father said, looking almost as uncomfortable as Vince in the sound-deadening, white-carpeted waiting room. Maybe it would help you with your schoolwork and open up more choices in the long run. But it's your choice what you do right now. Did I do badly on the test? Vince asked. On his last visit to Dr. Meadows, he tried to stay focused as he works through the interminable list of logic puzzles and word games she'd given him. But they were the kind of thing where 1 or 2 at a time were fun, but after that, it was hard to keep his mind from wandering. We're not supposed to tell you your score, his father replied. If it's too high, it could make you complacent, and if it's too low, it could make you feel bad. Does that mean you can tell me if it was just right? Vince's father looked confused. No, he decided. Otherwise, not telling you would tell you that it wasn't. Dr. Meadows opened the door to her office. Please, come in. Vince did his best to hide his impatience while she re-explained the principles of the device, as if the fact that he wasn't yet using it meant he couldn't possibly recall what she'd said to him the last time. When she finally asked him to take off his own glasses, and she pried the new ones out of their sleek black case, he caught the glorious factory fresh smell of them and had to force himself not to laugh. Oh, these transducers generate the ultrasound that will stimulate your olfactory nerves, she said, pointing to tiny silver rectangles on the nose pads. Let's try some calibrations first. He accepted the glasses from her and put them on, the lenses that matched his prescription, and the frames didn't feel any heavier than usual. He doubted anyone at school would even notice the change. Dr. Meadows thumbed through an app on her phone, then tapped something on the screen. Can you see what you're smelling? She asked. Vanilla? Vince did laugh now. It was insane how convincing the illusion was, as believable as the outgassing plastic in the glasses themselves. And now? Toast. Is it burned? I don't think so. Vince's mouth was watering slightly. The scent was so real that he could imagine butter melting through the crisp brown surface into the soft bread below. Before, he'd wondered why they'd never made movies that used this trick. But now it seemed obvious that it would be too distracting. No? Some kind of flour? I don't know the name. Then a whiff of ammonia, the stench of burning tires. Vince hoped these crude notes were just mapping the farthest corners of his olfactory gamut, planting signposts in the Badlands that he'd never have to visit again. All right, Dr. Meadows put down her phone. She led Vince through to the room where he'd sat for his previous assessment. The same tablet computer was waiting for him on the desk. I'd like you to try to solve these puzzles, she said, but it's important that you keep the glasses on while you work. How does that sound? It's fine, Vince replied. Maybe the first test had measured some kind of baseline to help choose the problems he'd be confronted with now. But he guessed what mattered most was the effect the glasses would have, not on his current performance, but on the follow-up. Dr. Meadows left him to it, The first puzzle involved a tangle of overlapping triangles, with the lengths of some edges marked and others to be found. Vince concentrated on the task, and it wasn't until he completed it that he even registered the subtle odor the glasses had been inducing while he worked, vaguely reminiscent of pencil shavings with a hint of loam. But it was fading now, and as he started on the second problem, it was replaced by something more like orange peel and copper wire. An hour later, Dr. Meadows returned, and Vince rejoined his father in her office. "Tonight, as you sleep, you'll need to wear a different set of transducers," she explained. She removed the second device from its packaging, and Vince tried it on. It was like a bandage stuck over the top part of his nose. "And this unit needs to sit by your bedside." She handed Vince's father a box the size of a small Wi-Fi router with the manufacturer's name, Combray, embossed on the side. In bed that night, Vince barely felt the tape against his skin, but he kept thinking about the software in the Combray box, a gargoyle squatting on his bookshelf, just waiting for him to drift off so he could reach across the darkness and run a red correction pen through his dreams. Did he really want to spend the next 4 years reliving every lesson in his sleep? Until now, his dreams had been a glorious refuge from the tedium and mundanity of school life. If his mind wasn't free when he lay down and closed his eyes, when would it be? But he needed this. His mother was unemployed, and his father was endlessly anxious, sure that he'd be made redundant any day now. Vince knew he was not exceptional himself in any way that he could imagine earning him an income. He needed some kind of advantage to have any hope of staying off the scrap heap. And of all the advantages money could buy, this seemed like the most honest, shoring up the foundations he was building for himself by making his brain a little less eager to recycle every hard-won lesson into rubble. In the morning, as soon as he woke, Vince knew that he'd dreamed about the puzzles he'd grappled with the day before. He'd followed the lengths and angles of a chain of triangles around a loop until the implications came full circle and a single answer was revealed. But in the dream, the whole pursuit had left him feeling as triumphant as a hunter who had just learned to corner an antelope, even if the odors evoked were milder and tamer than a terrified animal's sweat and dung. And later, he'd sketched Venn diagrams with all the care of a famished seed gatherer rehearsing the route to a newly found tree that would furnish his next 10 meals. Everything the glasses had marked with their scent and the gargoyle had summoned back into his mind had become vivid, urgent, and indelible. He climbed out of bed and walked down the hallway. In the kitchen, he poured a bowl of cereal and doused it with milk, leaving it to soak while he went to the toilet. It wasn't quite 6 in the morning, and his father's alarm clock had yet to go off. Vince finished eating and returned to his room. There were 3 more weeks until the start of school. He recalled his Uncle Benjamin, who had a Combray of his own and had paid for the gift, musing about all the skills he might have baked into his brain over the summer holidays if he'd had the same mental ratchet as a teenager that he'd had now. Vince picked up his tablet and opened the book of magic tricks he'd been browsing for the last few days, fascinated but not quite dedicated enough to commit to learning any of them. He wouldn't be returning to Dr. Meadows for the official verdict for another week, but the dreams already felt conclusive, and he might as well have some fun with the gargoyle before it became one more slave to the curriculum. 2. Put as many pieces on the board as you like. Whatever you want, Vince explained to the gathered circle of his friends. I'll keep my back turned. Tell the board you're done, and it will remove one of the pieces or put a new one on an empty square. Then you get to change one more square yourself. When I turn around, I'll look at the board and tell you exactly which square you changed, even though I never knew how it looked before. After some clarification of the rules, everyone agreed to them, though they were skeptical that Vince had any hope of success without cheating. Zach made him remove his glasses, and Mira checked that he wasn't wearing earbuds. Turn off the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth on the tablet if you like, Vince suggested, and Wahid took him up on that. Okay. Vince turned away, leaving them to slide pieces onto the virtual chessboard at will. When they tapped the Done button, there would normally have been an acknowledging ping, but Vince had preemptively turned off the sound in case someone accused him of receiving a secret message encoded in the tone. Okay, Zach said. We're finished. You can look. Vince turned and examined the board, scanning it quickly and performing all the calculations he needed in his head. 4th row down, 5th column, he announced. The last thing he did was adding that night. Zach laughed. Not bad, he said begrudgingly. Yeah, but you must have cheated somehow, Leon insisted. Blindfold me, Vince offered, or I can go and stand 20 meters away. Why does the board get to change one of the pieces? Mira asked suspiciously. Vince smiled. Well, those are the rules. Just as he was about to step away and let his friends commence round 2, he heard a hubbub from the other side of the quadrangle. He turned to see Jamie Mellick at the center of a small crowd of onlookers, apparently performing some kind of dance. Vince hesitated, wondering if the most merciful thing would be to urge his friends to ignore the whole spectacle. Jamie was the most uncoordinated person Vince had ever met, and he didn't want them adding to the pile on of ridicule. But as he stood listening to the response of the crowd, he realized that the shouts of admiration were not ironic. Nobody was laughing or mocking Jamie. They were enraptured. By now, Vince's friends had already gone in for a closer look, so he picked up his tablet and followed them. He couldn't squeeze into the front of the crowd, but he found a vantage point where he could get a decent view. Jamie was tap dancing on the concrete steps that led up to the platform at the end of the quad, joyfully, energetically, tirelessly, and though the rhythm was so complex it took Vince some time to be sure, flawlessly. It was breathtaking. Tap wasn't an art Vince had any particular knowledge of or fondness for, but Jamie seemed to have mastered moves so exuberant and so widely demanding that Vince could not imagine how he could have wrung more astonishment and exhilaration out of the audience, short of doing it all on the wing of a biplane. When Jamie finally ended his routine, the audience cheered and applauded, and his timing was perfect on another count. Seconds later, the siren sounded for the start of first period, sending everyone away with a smile on their face, but no chance to mob him and beg for his secret. Vince caught Jamie's eye and offered an admiring nod. Jamie beamed back at him, sweaty but elated. This was some special shit, Vince was sure, but surely not a Combre. Jamie could have practiced all summer, ratcheting up his progress with hardwood-scented dreams, and still not mastered a fraction of the skill he'd just displayed. But 10 minutes into Vince's English class, someone had already solved the mystery, having found the video diary of a novice learning a different style of dance with the help of a rudimentary exoskeleton. Vince felt a momentary pang of disillusionment, but then the diarist made it clear that you couldn't learn the moves the exoskeleton imposed on your limbs merely by surrendering to it, like a rag doll. It let you experience certain aspects of what an accomplished performance would feel like, giving you a clear target to aim for with each individual muscle and joint, which was easier than trying to steer the process by watching yourself in a mirror. But it was still up to you to find your own way to match those internal perceptions once you were standing entirely on your own 2 feet. Now, we'll parse this into subject and predicate, the avatar on the shared attention screen at the front of the classroom continued. The supervisor, who'd been listlessly watching the class from her desk, rose and walked down the aisle, perhaps hoping to learn the source of the delight on so many of the students' faces. But the app they'd been using to share the exoskeleton video detected her gaze and fled into the background, leaving nothing for her to see but a neatly diagrammed sentence. At lunchtime, Vince came clean to his friends, describing the calculations that let him identify the square they'd changed once the board's own small intervention had guaranteed the right kind of baseline. How long did it take to learn to do that in your head? Zach asked, still skeptical. Half an hour, a day, for 3 days. But my uncle bought me a Christmas present that helped me get more out of the practice sessions. He took off his glasses and pointed out the transducers, explaining their function. Everyone seemed to find the prospect of lessons with smell-o-vision track hilarious. Vince sat smiling as he waited for them to stop riffing off each other's fart jokes. It does work, though, he said, and nothing smells that bad. It's usually pretty low-key. The board trick smelled like some kind of dry leaves, but that was enough for me to pick up the trail. Can it teach you to dance like Jamie? Mira asked. Probably not, Vince admitted, but any jealousy he'd felt had had time to fade. And in all honesty, it wasn't the kind of skill he ever wanted. It's good to have both methods, he decided. Different ways to get one over on the machines. You mean get one over on the people who don't have the same machines as you do, Leon corrected him. It's just a different way of cheating for people who can't afford a Serrano. Mira scowled. Using sense as a cue isn't cheating. I color code my notes. It's not that different. Zach said, well, my cousins both have Serranos. When I call them, it's creepy as fuck. Sometimes it takes me 30 seconds to figure out if I'm talking to a human or not. And how's what Jamie did all that different? Leon persisted. I'm pretty sure he wasn't still wearing his robot dance teacher under his jeans. So if I use a Serrano for a couple of months and stop, that wouldn't be cheating? Leon countered. Wahid said, people who use a Serrano then stop usually end up worse than when they started. What happens when your cousins sit for exams? Vince asked Zach. They go to a private school that treats the Serranos as part of the person, Zach replied. They wouldn't expect you to switch it off in an exam any more than they'd ask you to switch off a pacemaker. Okay, but when they get to university? Zach said, a couple of universities have the same policy already, and 5 years from now, I think most employers will too. Your job, your degree, your CV will all belong to the pair, not the human alone. Wouldn't it be cheaper for companies to run their own AI instead of hiring all that dead weight to lip sync the answers? Mira suggested. Depends on the job, Wahid replied. There'll always be a few that can't be done that way for customer appeal or legal reasons. And somewhere, it's obvious an AI would be useless, but they'll still hire a human Serrano pair and claim that the Serrano will make them more efficient. Zach laughed. I can already see my cousin's future sleeping on the job or playing video games in their heads while their bodies are just there to reassure people there's a human in the loop. 3. Things might be tight for a while, Vince's father said. But we knew this was coming, so we prepared it for the best as we can. I don't want you to worry. The twins had gone to bed an hour before. Vince had been watching videos in his room, and he'd only come out to get a drink of water. But it looked like his parents had been waiting since dinner time to find the right moment to give him the news. How can people not need plumbers? Vince asked. I never saw a robot that could change a washer. Well, people still need plumbers, his father said, just not as many. In construction, there are more prefabbed units. In maintenance, one person can do more with new tools. Robots can't change washers, but the burrowers can lay pipes and the crawlers can clear blockages. What are you going to do? I'll retrain. As what? I haven't decided yet, but if it's a course that's on the list of skills shortages, well, I'll get a living allowance while I study, so that will help. You should take my glasses, Vince offered. They'll make it easier. His father smiled. Thanks, but I'll be okay. I'm glad the glasses are helping you. Maybe I'll get my own pair. Vince glanced at his mother, who'd been looking on in silence. She'd lost her job as a history teacher just after Carol and Ethan were born, and she'd studied for 3 years with the aim of becoming a lab technician in the mining industry, but she still hadn't found a position. I don't want you to be unhappy, Vince said. His father laughed and shook his head as if to dismiss the possibility, but he walked over to Vince and embraced him. I told you not to worry, he said. It will all be fine. 4. Vince's marks climbed, but as the end of term approached, he found himself looking back on the ascent with a sense of anticlimax. He hadn't conquered anything difficult. He'd just organized his efforts a little better than before, and with the Combre's help, everything he'd studied had fallen into place. Maybe he could get straight A's from here to the end of high school, and no doubt that would be better than failing. But would it really give him a chance to survive in the world, let alone achieve anything he could be proud of? On the last day before the break, when the gang came together on the lawn at lunchtime, everyone seemed equally restless. I heard Jamie made $3,000 in 2 weeks, Mira said, busking in Central Station at rush hour. Good for him, Vince replied. No one would tip a robot's owner for a machine doing what Jamie did, let alone pay money to watch a deepfake. But a human in the flesh could still be astonishing. He's found his thing. For now, Zach said. People will get bored with it eventually. That's when Vince will swoop in and wow everyone with his magic, Wahid joked. Vince laughed. That's not going to happen. Of the half-dozen tricks he'd learned, none had a payoff that came fast enough to make a weary commuter look twice. But If smell-o-vision is such a great superpower, why aren't you rich? Leon taunted him. Or did your uncle spend all that money just to give you a fancy version of color-coded binders? Maybe I needed the fancy version, Vince conceded. Not to get rich, just to stay in the race. But why are you giving me shit about it? Hyperfine minds who make the Serranos keep telling us they're changing the world for the better. But if that's true, why aren't we all rich? Because that's beyond their powers, Leon replied, even if they wanted it. Exactly. All they're really doing is clawing money out of terrified parents who think they're buying a future for their kids. But their kids will get the best jobs, Wahid predicted. The hype's too big to fail. Every CEO and their dog have already declared that Serranos will make the perfect workforce, tripling productivity and sending profits to the roof. Once you've written that into your earnings forecast, how do you back down? So we're screwed? Mira said blithely. Unless we can borrow Jamie's exo and get it to train us to be jewel thieves. Vince couldn't retreat into breezy cynicism. Everything cut too close now. He said, what if all the hype is wrong? What if Serranos don't make their partners any smarter and the humans don't do much for the Serranos either? There must be some way we can prepare for the moment when they start falling flat on their faces. Zach frowned. Prepare how? Oh, we need to be waiting in the wings, ready to step in and take their place, Vince decided. Ready to do what they promised but can't deliver. Zach said, well, if the companies have swallowed the hype, they might never admit that they were wrong. They might just keep the Serranos and find a way to work around the damage. Vince was undeterred. Then we'll need to be a part of how they work around the damage. Zach laughed uneasily. You really want to pin your hopes on picking up the pieces from the great Serrano crash? What if it happens before we've even finished high school? Or 5 years later, or never? Vince thought for a while. If it comes sooner than expected, that's great. That'll mean it was impossible to hide, and in the aftermath, there should be a chance for everyone. And if it doesn't come when you need it, Zach pressed him. Vince said, well, then we might have to give it a little push. 5. Over the break, Vince studied like never before. He looked up the curricula for all his courses for the rest of the year and worked his way through them, switching between subjects whenever he felt burned out, confident that he could pick up each thread again wherever he'd left off. In the second week, he'd made the whole endeavor 10 times easier by letting himself go off on tangents. The coursework itself was about as exciting as eating chalk, but much of it consisted of parts, however narrow, of larger bodies of knowledge that were packed with glorious puzzles and revelations. When the module on electricity threatened to extinguish every spark in his soul, Vince flew off for a day-long excursion into Faraday's insights and Maxwell's equations, the links to relativity, the quantum version, the unification with the weak force, and the role of Higgs boson. He returned, giddy and elated, to find that most of what he'd been struggling to absorb was now obvious from the wider context. I hope you're playing games with your friends, his father called to him through the door of his room. Vince didn't reply. It seemed wiser not to explain his ambitions. His father was also studying retraining as a refrigeration engineer, in between shifts of work for the Dole graffiti removal for the local council. Back at school, Vince kept up his schedule, wearing earbuds to block out the Avatar's lectures, and sandboxing the tutor on his tablet with a loop of himself paying attention to its earnest explication of things he already knew. In reality, he'd moved on to the next year's topics, but he kept exploring an ever wider swath of the surrounding territory. Classroom tests and homework dragged him back, but between the scent trails that helped him reload old perspectives and the broader view that put the material in context, he rarely had trouble jumping through those hoops. In the third week of term, Vince stayed late to finish a physics experiment, pretending he'd messed up his measurements of a simple RLC circuit, when he was really playing around with something more interesting. A bored supervisor watched videos on his phone while Vince's tutor babbled advice about checking the leads on alligator clips. Eventually, the supervisor hit the ceiling on his overtime and put an end to the experiment. As Vince left the school grounds, Zach caught up with him, having just finished 2 hours of swimming training. Have you been in detention? Zach joked. No, I was trying to understand super heterodyne mixing. You were What? Vince gave up on the idea of keeping his new regimen secret. There was nothing he could say now that would make sense, short of disclosing the whole backstory. Okay, Zach said. But where's the speed running every level of high school going to get you? Level with the Serranos, eventually. Zach regarded him dubiously. You know they can look up anything in a fraction of a second. Vince was unfazed. So what? There aren't many jobs that depend on reciting who won every Oscar in 1963. They can also calculate faster than you, Zach added. Not much faster than me with a calculator or the right kind of mathematics software. You might as well say that they can pick up a 10-ton weight by interfacing with a crane. Well, so can I if I have the same access codes. It's the crane that's doing the work. Zach's skepticism seemed to waver a little. But Serranos are still shinier, buzzier. Human and AI raised side by side, building on each other's strengths. I thought you said your cousins were lazy fucks who zone out in class and watch porn on their contact lenses while their better halves look up the answers on the net and treat them as ventriloquist dolls. Yeah, Zach agreed. But not all pairs are like that. I've met some of the other students at their school and... What? Zach seemed almost embarrassed, but he continued. They were only a couple of years older than me, but listening to them talk, it was like they'd seen everything, read everything, traveled the world. Vince said, There's a reason they call them Serranos. Did you ever really have a conversation that challenged them? Yeah, I asked for their analysis of Kierkegaard's Ninth Symphony while we played water polo in my uncle's pool. I'll take that as a no. So what's the plan? Zach asked. Turn yourself into a scratch and sniff prodigy and go start a degree before you turn 15? No, but we need to be able to show up the Serranos to prove that we're their equals, or better. Zach nodded. That shouldn't be too hard. So will you challenge them at Jeopardy, chess, or Go? I don't know what their weakness is yet, Vince admitted. But from the studies I've read, it's not just freeloaders like your cousins who end up losing their edge. Everyone offloads some competence and gets worse at some tasks. Yeah, but how does that help? Zach asked. You don't get to unplug the Serrano and leave the human stumbling around like a hiker who's lost GPS. GPS is pretty reliable, Vince mused. But if the map itself is wrong, you don't need to lose a signal to end up in a ditch. Okay. Well, good luck turning that metaphor into actual strategy. They'd reached the corner where they went different ways. He raised a hand in farewell, and they parted. 6. When Vince applied for a meeting with the school's head supervisor and chose the subject extracurricular activities from the drop-down menu, he was not optimistic. But he received a reply just 2 hours after completing the request, and his appointment was the very next day. Mr. Randall welcomed Vince into his office and got straight to the point. What did you have in mind? An inter-school academic challenge, Vince replied, between the 6 schools in the area like we do with sports. They were all public schools devoid of Serranos, but he couldn't approach the enemy directly. He had to start by laying down the bait. So, a general knowledge quiz, a debate, model United Nations, mathematical Olympiad? The coolest thing right now is called an adversarial quiz. Each team gets to choose the questions that their opponents have to answer. Mr. Randall was wary. Well, how is that fair? You could ask something impossibly hard or something you could only know yourselves. Well, if you think a question's unfair, you can always challenge it, Vince replied. It mustn't rely on secret knowledge or some huge prior effort. The questioners need to be able to show how to reach the answer with just a few minutes' work, starting from facts that are well known among their peers. Who decides what is or isn't well known? Well, there's a panel of 3 adjudicators for each match, drawn from the other schools in the competition, and if there's any favoritism or collusion, they'll soon get shamed by the audience. Vince showed him a clip that demonstrated the whole system working well enough. The question was ingenious, and the contestants struggled and failed. But when they raised the challenge, the questioners demonstrated an easy route to the answer, and in the end, no one argued with the adjudicators. "Well, this will take some coordination between the schools," Mr. Randall warned him, "and the students elsewhere might not be interested." Of course, Vince conceded, but he'd already poked the wasp's nest of parochial pride with an informal online challenge, and he was sure there'd soon be plans to join the competition underway in other schools. It took 8 weeks of organizing before the first round finally started. West Ryde was pitted against Denniston, with Zach, Wahid, and Mira joining Vince, while Leon had agreed to be an adjudicator at Eastwood versus Epping. The event began half an hour after the class on Monday, and the audience easily fitted into a single row of seats in the echoing hall. But there was a video feed going out, both live and recorded, and as Vince and his teammates took their place on stage, he was hoping for hard questions and a close run, bringing some prestige to the competition itself, whoever won. Everyone introduced themselves. Imani, Sam, Kyle, Dorothy looked confident, and Denniston had bussed in about as many supporters as had turned up for the local team. Imani asked the first question. "Throw a pair of 6-sided dice and draw 2 cards, without replacement, from a shuffled deck of 52. With the cards valued 1 to 13, black cards positive and red cards negative, what is the chance that the total value of the dice evenly divides the total value of the cards?" Vince's team had 5 minutes to respond, and only pens and paper to help them. They'd agreed in advance to work independently. If they reached different answers, they could share notes and argue about each other's methods. The best strategy, Vince decided, would be the one that made the most of the problem's symmetries. And beyond the simple symmetries that came from swapping suites, he realized that if he grouped the total values for the cards into pairs, using a simple rule, there were always 196 ways to reach one or other of the pair. There were exactly as many ways to draw a total that was either 26 or 1 as there were to get 25 or 2, 24, 3, and so on. Surely there was a way to exploit that and capture all the possibilities in a single calculation. But the dice refused to play dice. The 17 ways a throw of the dice could divide a total of 24 for the cards bore no relationship to the 2 ways they could divide a total for the cards of 3. He'd wasted time on a mirage. He started racing through the 27 totals individually, but he was barely halfway through when the buzzer rang. Wahid and Zach put down their pens, equally frustrated. But Mira handed Vince a sheet with her final result circled, and he read from it aloud. 677 out of 3,978. Imani smiled, and Vince assumed that it was a bad sign, but their rival seemed genuinely delighted as she gave the verdict. Correct! There was a 2-minute break before the round continued. "We could have split the work into 2 for that one and finished twice as fast," Mira noted. "Not into 4?" Zach asked, half joking. "Better to have 2 answers to check against each other," Mira replied. Vince asked the first question, directed at Denniston. Given a 12-sided regular polygon, if you wrote down the areas of every triangle whose vertices are 3 distinct vertices of the polygon, how many different values would there be? As their opponents set to work, huddling and whispering to each other to plan their strategy, Vince found himself willing them to succeed. Let them find the best way to share the load, and the slickest tricks to simplify the calculations. Though his ultimate goal was to goad the self-appointed best and brightest to swoop down and join the fray, he also wanted his fellow humans to shine along the way. The buzzer sounded. Imani said, "There are 12 possible shapes for the triangles. If you treat mirror images as identical, which comes from the ways you can write 12 as a sum of 3 positive integers, but 2 of those shapes from 2 + 2 + 8 and 1 + 4 + 7 have identical areas. So there are only 11 different values in the list." "Correct," Vince confirmed. He'd set a trap and Denniston had found it and disarmed it, but that was much more gratifying than if they'd fallen right in. It was Sam's turn to put a question to West Ryde. "Can you find an integer," he asked, "whose reciprocal has a recurring decimal with 10 repeating digits, all of them different?" Vince's first response was to silently scoff that recurring decimals were primary school mathematics, so the problem ought to take 30 seconds at most, but then he realized he had no idea at all how to solve it efficiently. Wahid said, 1/7 is 0.142857 recurring, because 7 times 142,857 is 999,999. Don't we just need something similar with 10 nines instead of 6? Mira winced. Yeah, we just need to factor a 10-digit number by hand. 3 divides it once, then again, Zach volunteered. Then 11. But once those factors had been taken out, they were left with 101,010,101, which no longer yielded the new divisors at a glance. They started testing other small primes, splitting up the sequence between the 4 of them. Vince had just ruled out 13 and 29 when Wahid declared that 41 was a bullseye, leaving them with 2,463,661. Is this the point where we build our own quantum computer out of sticks and bottle caps? Zach asked plaintively. Hang on. There's one obvious number that divides the thing with 10 nines, the thing with 5 ones. Which is not divisible by 11, Vince noted, but it is divisible by 41. It was 11,111 divided by 41 gave 271, which Vince knew was prime. Zach divided their daunting partial result, 2,463,661 by 271, bringing it down to 9,091. That smells like a prime to me, but I don't think we have time to check. Vince looked to the clock. They only had 90 seconds left to make sense of these fragments. Multiplying all the definitely prime factors they found gave them 1,099,989, which didn't have enough digits, let alone distinct ones. They could start throwing in 9,091 and leave out some other factors, but which ones exactly? If the answer is big, the reciprocal could have 3 or 4 zeros at the start before it begins repeating, Wahid realized. So we really should be looking for factors of numbers with 10 nines followed by a few zeros. Vince stared at the 7-digit number they'd reached. Try multiplying this by 125, he told Wahid. I'll try 128. Powers of 2 or 5, divisors of the extra factors of 10. Vince started calculating, but halfway through, he'd already produced 9 twice. Then Wahid slid a sheet across the table with his own result. He'd multiplied by 1,000, then divided by 8, yielding 137,498,625. Every digit exactly once, including an unwritten 0 at the start, which in the fraction would become visible and also be repeated. The buzzer rang. Vince gestured to Wahid to do the honors. We factored the number with 10 nines and 3 zeros, Wahid explained, into 137,498,625 and 9,091 times 8, which is 72,728. So the reciprocal of 72,728 has all 10 digits repeating. That's correct, Sam conceded. The audience cheered, and some of the meager home crowd stomped on the wooden floor. Vince was elated, but also exhausted and amazed. He felt like the 4 of them had just sprinted up a hill backward, shouting advice and encouragement to each other along the way. Wahid had the next question for Deniston. In the jelly bean factory, 6 chutes emerge into the packing room, arranged in a circle. Going clockwise around the circle, they supply red only, green only, blue only, mixed green and blue, mixed red and blue, and mixed red and green jelly beans. But all the labels for the chutes have fallen off, so although you know the sequence of colors, you don't know where it starts. If you can sample at most 1 jelly bean from each chute, what is the average number of jelly beans required to be sure you know exactly what every chute supplies? When the buzzer rang, Kyle announced confidently, You always need at least 2 samples, but never more than 3. On average, it takes 2 and 1/3. But what happens to the black jelly beans? They get diverted to my private supply, Wahid replied. But your answer is correct. After the break, Kyle rose to his feet again. The Acme Bus Company runs service for 1 intercity route every 3 days, for another route every 5 days, and for a 3rd route every 6 days. Their competitor, Zoetrope, wants to service the same 3 routes with the same kind of regular timing, no less often than weekly, but they never want buses running the same route on the same day as their competitor. How many possible schedules does Zoetrope have to choose from? Vince wrote down the crucial numbers, 3, 5, 6. The simplest way to avoid a clash would be to match Acme's frequencies on each route while choosing a different offset for the days. But for the 3rd route, Zoetrope could also avoid clashes by running buses every 2nd or 3rd day. That gave him a total of 64. But when he looked around to see if any of his teammates had finished their own calculations, he saw that Mira had arrived at 192. Where does the extra 4 come from for the first route? Vince asked. As he was speaking, Wahid handed him a sheet with 192 as the result, and Zach said, I get 64. The first route can run every 3 days in one of 2 slots, but also every 6 days in any of 4 slots. Ah, of course. Vince turned to Zach, who said, Okay, I get it, but you can't pull the same trick on the other routes because doubling the gap would make it less than weekly. The buzzer rang and Mira rose to tender their result, but Kyle said, I'm sorry, that's not correct. There are 10 choices for the 3rd route. Why? Mira demanded. The gap needs to divide 6, and then there are 1 fewer slots than the gap. The divisors are 6, 3, and 2, so the slot counts are 5, 2, and 1. The gaps don't need to divide 6, Kyle replied. A gap of 4 days would work just as well, starting either 1 day after one of the Acme buses or 3 days after. Mira thought it over. Oh, you're right. She nodded resignedly and took her seat. How did we miss that? She asked her teammates. Zach said, Well, the same way Vince and I missed the case you caught. We all thought the pattern was simpler than it was. A chime marked the end of the break, and Mira rose to ask her own question. People are standing in a queue waiting to get into a concert. The promoters decide to give away some free merch using the following system. Every ticket to the concert includes a 20-digit random number. The promoters obtain their own random number from a spare ticket they're holding. Then everyone in the queue checks whether their number is higher or lower than that. Starting from the 2nd place in the queue, every 2nd person receives a free t-shirt if they fall into the same group, higher or lower, as the majority of people ahead of them. As the queue grows longer, what is the probability that a new person joining an even-numbered position will receive a free t-shirt? Vince watched the opposition as he absorbed the question. Some of them were smiling as if they'd cracked the whole thing already. He tried to regain his original spirit of generosity toward them, but it was a struggle to cheer them on now that West Ride's place in the competition was at risk. The buzzer sounded, and Dorothy announced her team's consensus. 1/2, she said. That's the limit as the queue gets longer. That's not correct, Mira replied. The answer is 3/4. Dorothy was silent for a moment, but she didn't seem entirely surprised. We'd like to see a derivation, she said. Mira walked over to the whiteboard and picked up a blue marker. Starting from the fact that all the ticket holders, including the promoters, were equally likely to appear in every possible order when ranked according to the ticket's random numbers, it only took a few lines of algebra to show that the probability for the nth person in the queue to get a t-shirt when n was even was 3n plus 2 divided by 4n plus 4. As n grew larger, this approached 3/4. So that's a draw, the chief adjudicator proclaimed, addressing the camera. Congratulations to both teams. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to check out the other 2 matches that were in play this afternoon. The rivals came together and shook hands. We just got lost with that last one, Vince heard Imani confess to Mira. We convinced ourselves it was a half by symmetry. As he walked home, slowly, his body inexplicably aching, as if he'd just been through some kind of physical ordeal, Vince mulled over the failures he'd witnessed. It was easy to get trapped by the sense that you'd grasped the essence of a problem, then let that steer the calculations. His own team hadn't made any arithmetical errors in the bus scheduling problem. They'd just stopped looking for solutions beyond the obvious ones, and he was entirely sympathetic to the lure of symmetry that had mesmerized Deniston. And the Serranos? What would mesmerize them or hide in their own blind spots? After dinner, Vince sat in his room and watched the other matches. Epping had defeated Eastwood 3-2, and Dundas and Meadowbank had drawn 2-2. There were some tough questions, and he would need to go over the videos with his team at their next training session. But for now, he just let the sense of 3 problems he'd grappled with resonate in his brain as he lay down and closed his eyes and waited for the gargoyle to do its thing. Seven. In the second round of the competition, West Ryde defeated Dundas 3-2. In the third round, they did the same to Meadowbank. In the fourth, they tied with Epping 2-2, and in the fifth, they tied with Eastwood 3-3. Epping emerged from the 5 rounds with 14 points, West Ryde with 13, Eastwood with 11, and the other 3 teams with 10. "This is exciting," Vince's father said over dinner when he learned that they'd made it to the final. "The whole family will be there to cheer you on." "No, you should just stream it," Vince urged him. "We won't embarrass you," his mother promised. "We're not going to wave a big banner and shout your name." "We will shout your name," Ethan interjected. "I won't," Carol said, glaring at Ethan. It'll be easier to concentrate if I'm not thinking about anything else." "All right, I get it. We can watch from home." They continued the meal in silence. No one else seemed to have any news to share. His father had completed his refrigeration certificate, but so far, he'd been unable to get a single interview. His mother had been doing volunteer work in a charity shop for the last 18 months, but now she'd been told that the shop was closing down. "Whoever wins the final," Vince said. "I'm hoping that it won't be the end of it. I'm hoping they'll widen the competition and bring in a few more schools." His father smiled. "Not content with conquering the northern suburbs. You want to be national champions?" "I wouldn't go that far. I'd be happy with just one more match." Epping had never lost, though, and even if West Ryde held them to another draw, Epping would win on points. For his team to be the ones to take on their real adversaries, they'd still need an unprecedented victory first. 8. Wahid put the first question to Epping. "Give a polynomial in x and y with integer coefficients whose 0 set looks like 2 decimal digits with the same height and width, and where the 2-digit number they represent is the coefficient of x in each of the polynomial's factors." Hardeep, Gemma, Lance, and Eunice spent about 30 seconds discussing strategy before setting to work. Vince was in 2 minds about the difficulty of their task. The number portrayed could really only be 80 or 88. Still, typesetting digits as algebraic curves required a certain attention to detail, and under pressure, anyone could make a mistake. "Can we just write the answer rather than reading it out loud?" Hardeep asked the chief adjudicator, Thomas. "Go ahead," Thomas replied. The 3 factors Hardeep wrote on the whiteboard were exactly the ones Wahid had chosen, an 8 formed from 2 circular loops, and a 0 from an adjacent ellipse. Hardeep's question for West Ryde toyed with the infinite. A merry-go-round with a radius of 8 meters rotates twice every minute. Halfway out from the center sits a 1/8 scale replica of the entire merry-go-round, rotating at the same rate, which includes a replica of the replica, and so on. There are 8 horses on the merry-go-round, arranged evenly around the perimeter, and the center of the first replica lines up with one of the horses. If each full-scale horse weighs 50 kilograms, what is the total momentum of all the horses at the moment when the centers of all the merry-go-rounds line up on one straight line? Vince believed he could see a clear path ahead, and it seemed safer to talk it through with his teammates than have them all work separately and compare notes at the end. "All the top-level horses' momenta add up to 0, he said, by symmetry. And for each of the lower levels, it's almost as good. Their velocities add up to number of horses times the velocity of their own merry-go-round center. From there, all the scaling and summing was easy enough in principle, but complicated enough for errors to slip in." Zach, Wahid, and Mira checked his algebra, and they all tackled the arithmetic of plugging in the specific numerical values. They reached a consensus a few seconds before the buzzer. "The total momentum to 4 decimal places is 0.6561 kilogram meters per second, but I can write out the exact fraction of pi if you prefer," Hardeep said. "That's correct. No need for the precise value." Vince delivered the next question to Epping. A special coin has been minted in the shape of a regular 12-sided polygon. Each side is 8 millimeters long, and the coin is 2 millimeters thick. Imagine tossing it into the air, then taking a snapshot, freezing it in mid-flight at a random moment. Repeat this over and over again. If every possible way the coin could be oriented in these snapshots is equally likely, what's the average difference in height between the highest and lowest points on the coin? He watched his rivals as they absorbed the scenario, extracting the geometric essence of the problem. Then he waited, tensed, half expecting them to respond in a minute or two. If they did, he'd have no one but himself to blame. But he still felt better about asking a question where the answer became insanely easy if you found the right approach, than one where you had to slog through endless computations regardless. The buzzer rang. Gemma wrote Epping's result on the whiteboard in fractions and square roots, adding, "It comes to about 15.5. Vince said, "That's not correct. The average is exactly 25 millimeters. Gemma laughed curtly. "That can't be right. We might be off slightly, but we must be close. The coin's longest diagonal is about 31 millimeters. When you take the average height of a line segment over all orientations, you get half of its length. So it has to be close to 15.5. "Do you want me to give my derivation?" Vince asked. "Go ahead." He joined her at the whiteboard. "You can generate the shape of this coin by taking 7 line segments," he began. 6 that correspond to consecutive edges of one face of the coin, and 1 that corresponds to an edge that's perpendicular to both faces. If you add up every possible choice of 7 points from those 7 line segments, treating each point as a vector, you get a 12-sided prism that matches the shape of the coin. Vince drew a sketch showing how the first 6 segments created a single, polygonal face, which was then extruded into a prism by adding points from the 7th segment. After staring at the diagram for a while, Gemma said, "Okay, I think I agree with you so far, but what does that prove?" "Adding up the points from these segments, then projecting them onto a vertical line is the same as projecting them first and then adding them up. So we can get the projection of the entire coin that way. But we know that the average height of each projection is half the length of the original segment, just as you said. So the average of the sum of those heights is half the sum of the segment's lengths. 6 times 8 plus 2 gives 50. Halved gives 25. So the average vertical distance from the lowest point of the coin to the highest is 25 millimeters. Gemma walked back to the table and conferred with her team. "You're right," she said. "We concede." There was some applause from the audience, but even West Ride's most enthusiastic supporters sounded more cautious than triumphalist. Their team still couldn't afford to get a single question wrong. "An ornamental fish vendor has 20 rare fish on sale for $100 each," Gemma began. "The weight of any given fish has a 50% chance of being 3 grams, a 25% chance of being 2 grams, and a 25% chance of being 4 grams. Unbeknownst to the vendor, you're certain that one of these fish has swallowed a diamond ring worth $1,000 and weighing 5 grams. If you buy some of the fish, you could identify one with the ring by weighing them all individually, but you could only resell the others at half price. The vendor will let you use the scales just once to weigh any single group of fish you like before you choose the ones you purchase. What should you do to maximize your expected profit?" Vince was tempted to reply, "Buy the fish that's struggling the hardest to retain its buoyancy." "So we weigh some of the numbers of fish," Mira suggested. "Then either buy them or buy all the others, depending on the result?" "I can't think of another strategy," Wahid replied, and neither could Vince or Zach. Vince stared at the notes he'd made on the possible weights for a single fish, 2, 3, or 4 grams, with their associated probabilities of a quarter, a half, and a quarter. What they needed was the same kind of table for a batch of any number of fish. But with 3 different weights involved, surely that was going to be some kind of trinomial nightmare. Then he realized that the shortcut Epping had built into the problem was hiding in plain sight. "Those quarter, half, quarter probabilities are exactly the same as you get for the head counts from tossing a fair coin twice," he said. "So if we weigh F fish, the weights will just follow the probabilities for tossing twice as many coins." "But what's the best F?" Mira asked. and the best threshold weight to buy on. She thought for a while. I bet it's close to half the total on sale, and the threshold weight is close to the mean. Vince found her hunch persuasive, though he couldn't see how to make it exact or quantify the correction if it wasn't. So we hunt around the middle, he proposed. Weigh 10, 9, 8 fish and look at the payoff if we buy the batch when it's greater than or equal to 3 grams per fish. Zach said, I'd bump up the threshold for the total weight of the batch by at least 3 grams, because the ring's 5. Yes, Mira agreed. They allocated a handful of cases between them, and it was soon clear that for a given number of fish, Zach's version of the threshold weight was exactly on target. Raising or lowering it always gave a lower yield. But as they went from 10 fish down to 8, the payoff was still rising. $324.99, $333.19, $334.40. Had it peaked or not? What's 7? Vince pleaded. But they only had 30 seconds remaining, and no one had even started the calculation. The buzzer rang. Vince exchanged glances with his teammates to see if anyone else wanted to make the call, but they didn't, so he rose to his feet. To maximize your expected profits, you should weigh 8 of the fish, he declared. If the weight is 27 grams or more, buy those 8 fish. Otherwise, buy the remaining 12. Gemma said, Correct. Vince sat down as cheers broke out. An informed guess wasn't cheating. They weren't expected to supply a watertight proof, but he would have felt better if they'd managed to verify that the payoff for the 7 fish was lower. Zach asked the last question for Epping. 2 spacecraft piloted by a smuggler and a customs inspector are a certain distance apart and initially at rest with respect to each other. If the smuggler accelerates straight toward the inspector at the maximum rate its engines allow, never changing course, while the inspector's spacecraft accelerates at twice that rate, the inspector can match both the velocity and the position of the smuggler in exactly 1 hour. But if the inspector wanted to reduce the time from 1 hour to 30 minutes, what ratio would their spacecraft's acceleration need to have to the smuggler's? Vince felt sure now that the problem was too easy, but it was too late to fret about that. He tried to relax and prepare himself for whatever was coming next. He gulped down all the chilled water that remained in his flask. It sloshed around inside him, distending his stomach. But then the cooling sensation in his throat and a sense of clarity that seemed to flow up through his palate more than made up for the discomfort. Lance said, The ratio of accelerations needed to have the interception time is 3 plus the square root of 10. Well, that's correct, Zach acknowledged. The applause from the local crowd was raucous and impassioned. Vince felt a surge of camaraderie, both for the team and for their supporters. He still desperately wanted to defeat them, but they were all celebrating the same human skills. Lance stood to deliver the final question. Take an isosceles triangle with a height 5/8 of its base and cut it into 4 pieces that can be reassembled as a square. Exactly one of the pieces as a right-angled triangle. What is the area of that triangle as a fraction of the whole? Wahid started making sketches. Since the original triangle had no right angles, the 4 corners of the square had to arise from the various cut lines, meeting each other at 90 degrees. One possibility would be a single cut lopping the triangle into 2 pieces, which were then each divided by cuts perpendicular to the first one. If the main cut and one side cut both had endpoints on the same edge of the original triangle, that would produce the sole triangular piece. The other 3 pieces would be quadrilaterals. How do we make sure that these bits all fit together? Wahid asked. Match some angles to get rid of any kinks and some lengths. He rubbed his temples, agitated. Vince wished he could leap in and provide a clear answer. The criteria ought not be all that complicated. But he couldn't keep the geometry straight in his head. They didn't have scissors to physically perform the dissection, so he redrew the pieces combined in a rough square. But as he struggled to identify which angles needed to do what in order to keep the square's sides straight, Zach began drawing a new version of his own. What if we extend each piece of the triangle into a separate copy of the square? He said, illustrating the idea. Every piece stayed where it was, but by adding adjoining copies of the other 3 pieces around it, 4 squares appeared, each one identically chopped into 4. Mira said, I'll now do the same thing with the squares, grow each piece into a triangle of its own. Zach complied. Each square sprouted 3 more triangles, though there were some overlap between them. And again, he said, filling in the pieces to make more squares, then more triangles. The page was now covered in a mosaic, a periodic arrangement of the 4 pieces of the dissection that the eye could group together either as strips of adjoining squares or strips of triangles pointing alternatively up and down. It made the nature of the dissection obvious, but they still needed to quantify everything. The whole team worked on the geometric fine print and cross-checked the results, transforming Zach's sketch from an appeal to the eye into a watertight mathematical promise. Vince finally looked at the clock. 40 seconds remained, and this time a guess would not be good enough. They had everything they needed to find the area of the triangular piece, but it was going to take a few more calculations. As the buzzer rang, he was still writing out the last step. He put down his pen and looked up from the page, performing the final multiplication in his head. The square root of 2 1/5, he said, divided by 8. Lance said, "That's correct." He lowered his gaze for a moment, clearly fighting to overcome his disappointment, but then faced his opponents and addressed them graciously. "Congratulations," he said. "You earned the win and will look forward to a rematch next year." 9. "I need a favor," Vince told Jamie after finally tracking him down with just minutes to spare before the start of his 4th period. Jamie regarded him with a mixture of amusement and mild surprise, but no hostility. They'd never been close friends, but Vince had always got on well with him prior to his ascent into the cultural stratosphere. He knew he was being presumptuous, but it wasn't as if he were a former tormentor, coming to beg forgiveness or trying to pretend that he'd always been on the victim side. "I'm not going to dance at anyone's party," Jamie replied. "Not for money, not for exposure." Exposure? Some millionaire wanted me to perform for free at a fundraiser for the State Opera, and the payoff was that all the beautiful people would be talking about me. All I want is a shout out for the AQ. I want to rub some faces in it. "You mean West Ride triumphs over Epping? Woohoo! Isn't that what the school mascot is for?" "It's not like that," Vince replied. "I just want to get under the skin of the Serrano users. And the faux anime marsupial that announced all that West Ride sporting wins had a follower count in the low double digits." Jamie seemed puzzled for a moment, then he grinned with delight. "You want to take them on? But you want them to be the ones to lay down the challenge? To think it's their own idea?" "Yes. I'm always happy to talk up the humans," Jamie declared, "but I'm not sure that many Serranos watch my channel." Jamie had invested some of his busking money in a camera that cryptographically signed its output, proving that the routines he recorded weren't fake. And last time Vince had checked, he had more than 6 million subscribers. Every little bit helps. That night, Jamie ad-libbed a few sentences about the adversarial quiz. Vince had contemplated trying to script something, but he was glad he hadn't. Jamie's own words sounded, if not utterly spontaneous, more like the product of his own personal musings on intelligence and creativity than something he'd been pressed into service to deliver. Over the next few days, Vince followed the subsequent chatter online. Only a tiny fraction of Jamie's viewers had anything to say on the subject, but the mere fact that they were endorsing his celebration of human prowess invited pushback, in part from people calling him a hypocrite because he'd gotten his own start via a machine. Then came the second wave, pointing out that Jamie's exo had only acquired the means to guide him at all by studying 1 million hours of footage of human dancers. And as for the significance of unaided humans vying against each other at AQ, well, those who found it uplifting were soon in heated battle with those who considered it a joke. One Serrano would wipe the floor with those Neanderthals, Symbiont 621 opined. In what universe would anyone need to solve a real problem without a bot beside them? Vibe Pilot 4943 scoffed. After a week or so, the whole topic fizzled out, but Vince didn't give up hope. What mattered in the end was not the level of ongoing bluster from full-time shit posters, but any lingering unease the discussion had provoked in the administrators of Serrano-friendly schools, whose marketing strategy relied on assuring parents that their little darlings, rather than growing weak and over-reliant on their tech, would be permanently and incontrovertibly lofted high above the unaugmented riffraff. A month later, after the AQ final, Vince received a message from Mr. Randall. Trentham College has sent their congratulations to West Ride's adversarial quiz team on their recent win. Also, their principal wants to invite the team to a demonstration match. What do you think? It sounds strange to me. You four with pens and paper and the other team with built-in AIs. Talk it over with your friends and let me know how you want to reply. 10. As the bus turned off the street into the entrance road, nothing about Trentham College struck Vince as being much different from any other upmarket private school. The buildings were sandstone, possibly predating electric light, and the sports fields were so vast and uniformly green that they looked less like genuine vegetation than something from a video game. He could see a group of students playing field hockey, so distant that their shouts were barely audible. Well, that's a letdown, Mira said. I was expecting a polo match at the very least. They must be waiting for approval to give the ponies their own chips, Wahid suggested. Is your cousin's school like this? Vince asked Zach. The grounds are smaller, Zach replied. In proportion to the fees? Mira joked. In proportion to the students' laziness. They'd never put up with having to walk that far. When the bus had parked in a spot marked and reserved for them, West Ride's team and supporters were greeted by 3 members of the Trentham Student Council, who escorted them into the Great Hall. The present audience did not come close to filling the stained-glassed cavern, but it still outnumbered any of the crowds Vince had seen at previous matches, including the final against Epping. One of the counselors introduced the team to the adjudicators, generously supplied by Epping, Eastwood, and Denniston, and their opposition, Matthew and Sybil. It was Trentham who'd proposed that a team of 2 AI-human pairs would be a suitable match for 4 humans, and Vince had seen no reason to oppose the composition. If anything, it understood the claims by Hyperfine that a single pair would soon replace a dozen people right across the knowledge-based workforce. As Vince shook Sybil's hand, she met his gaze, and he felt a frisson of unease. He did not believe that Serranos were conscious, but Sybil herself was still a different kind of person than he was accustomed to dealing with. What it was like to swim through life with an untiring companion, fluent, and apparently endlessly knowledgeable, catching your mistakes, offering advice, feeding you bon mot and tips on etiquette as easily as it solved partial differential equations. His own tutors were crude and bumbling even when they managed to dollop out the curriculum without errors, but whatever the Serranos' flaws in their attempts to grasp the complexity of the world, it was rare for their critics to fail to acknowledge their silver tongues. The teams and the adjudicators took their seats, then Sybil rose and the audience fell silent. In the wizard's castle in the Bavarian forest, Sybil began, the enchanted mice play a game with the grandfather clock. A minute or 2 before each hour strikes, they swarm out from their hiding place and take turns moving the hour hand around, making sure to return it to the correct position by the time the clock chimes. Each mouse has instructions to move the hand by first multiplying the angle measured clockwise from midnight by a certain factor, then advancing it by a certain number of hours. Both numbers must appear on the clock face, but the multiplier must satisfy a further requirement. If its square were used to multiply the angle, that would return the hand to its original position. Each mouse has their own unique pair of numbers, and between them they encompass all the possibilities the rules allow. But to keep them from growing bored, every month the wizard switches the numbers around. He picks a pair of mice whose instructions, if performed one after the other, would bring the clock's hour hand back to where it started. Call these mice Anderson and Grimm. Then, for each mouse, the wizard determines the overall effect of performing the first Grimm's, then the mouse's, then Anderson's instructions, as they were for the previous month, and he gives these new numbers to the mouse for the months to follow. All of this worked splendidly for many years, but then the wizard's cousin came to visit while the change was taking place, and he asked why it was performed this way. The wizard replied that, though each mouse's instructions varied from month to month, any sequence of mice whose combined shenanigans returned the hour hand to where it had started would find that their actions continued to yield the same result even after the change. No other system, the wizard suggested, could ensure that remained the case. The cousin thought for a while, then told the wizard that there was another way. He offered a method with the same guarantee, but though it could be mimicked for each mouse individually by choosing their own personal Anderson and Grimm, it could never have followed from applying the wizard's old method, where just one pair of mice took on those roles for everyone. The question, then, is can you give a formula that the cousin might have used for this new way to change the mice's numbers? Vince's teammates looked as if they'd just been ambushed by a bad bedtime story, so he did his best to break the spell. Strip away all the flowery language, and the mice are just functions that take x to a times x plus b. Everything is done in modular arithmetic, with x and b ranging from 0 to 11, but a needs its square to be 1. Julo, 12. So 1, 5, 7, 11. That means every mouse function has an inverse, and the inverse of a times x plus b is just a times x minus a times b. Mira said, "Cool." Almost deadpan, but with the faintest hint of trepidation. Trentham had chosen to evoke West Ride's first error, the bus scheduling problem, which had also involved modular arithmetic. But surely they knew that their opponents would have worked hard to address that weakness. So perhaps they were counting on a sense of complacency now that the hole had supposedly been so thoroughly patched. But Vince didn't have time to ponder these mind games. Okay, what's the wizard's usual method for altering the mouse functions? That's just conjugation. You sandwich one function between another one and its inverse, the Anderson and the Grimm. Wahid had an aha moment. And if a whole string of different functions canceled out before the change, then after the change, the Andersons and Grimms you wrapped around them will also cancel out, and the clock hand will still end up backwards started. So the wizard's method works, Zach said. But what the hell is the cousin up to? Vince said, the cousin's formula always has to look like the result of some conjugation, he wrote. He wrote out the details. Except the cousin gets to choose a different C and D for each mouse, Mira noted. For 48 mice, that's some astronomical number of options. Well, what if we fix C and make D depend on A alone, Vince suggested. And for a consistency check, he worked through the effects of one mouse with an A of 7 followed by another with an A of 5 before and after the cousin's change, and ended up with a formula for a function he called Z. Mira started listing the choices for Z, and for the 3 A values that mattered, 5, 7, and 11, there were only 6 possibilities. Wahid said, each of these has the same D. For all of the A's, they're just D from 0 to 5. Vince could see that now. Okay, so where did we go wrong? No one answered him, but they all began rechecking everything in sight. Then Zach emitted a sudden groan. Oh, the castle's in friggin' Bavaria. German uses 24-hour time. Vince looked to the adjudicator's un-Bavarian clock. The team had slightly more than a minute to recover from the misstep. He took the simplest of Mira's examples, 0, 6, 6, and began to reinterpret it. Modulo, 24. The first 6 was 3 times 1 minus 7, while the second 6 was 9 times 1 minus 11. So different D's, different Andersons, and Grimms. They were in the clear. Now they just needed to find the next 4 numbers for A of 13, 17, 19, and 23. Vince guessed they could set Z of 13 equal to 0, then get the rest by generalizing the consistency formula, replacing the 5 and 7 with other values. When the buzzer rang, he stood and spoke calmly, though his legs were trembling. One method the cousin could have used would be to multiply by... Vince realized he hadn't made a choice for C, so he grabbed one from thin air. 5, the number of hours each mouse advanced the clock's hand, then add 6 if their angle factor was equal to 7, 11, 19, or 23. With all of this arithmetic performed modulo 24. Sybil said, "Correct." The cheers and shouts from the West Ride supporters drowned out the polite applause from the Serrano pairs. Vince's spirits soared, even as he imagined the online commentary. Hamstrung by rules limiting their questions to those an unaided human could handle, the Serranos never had a chance to display their true superhuman skills. But the real test would come when the roles were reversed. No one was throttling the Serranos' power to find answers. Every Sunday for the past 30 years, Zach began, Peter has gone for a 16-kilometer hike along the same route near his home. But last weekend, he and his wife were visiting her parents, so he went for a hike about the same length along a different route. Every time he hikes, Peter records any sightings of 4 animals that are common in the region: the yellow and brown lemmings and the gray and white skinks. The yellow lemmings and the gray skinks are only seen at altitudes below 100 meters, while the brown lemmings and the white skinks are only seen above 400 meters. If the sightings for each animal are grouped by which quarter of the hike they were made in, they form a 4x4 square. Zach proceeded to list not the contents of each square, but the row sums, the column sums, and the sums along 7 diagonals for the sightings made on Peter's most recent hike near his own home and the hike near his parents-in-law's house. On Monday morning, Peter's wife asked him what the biggest difference was between the hikes in the 2 places. His reply contained a 6-letter word in English that can describe certain kinds of animals. What was that word most likely to be? The information provided was not enough to reconstruct all the data, but it did constrain it. Vince expected the Serranos to have enumerated the possibilities in a fraction of a second, but what came next would depend on exactly how the results were analyzed and shared with the humans. The buzzer sounded, and Sybil rose to present her team's response. Given that lemmings are a kind of rodent and skinks are a kind of lizard, those are 2 obvious candidates for the answer. Peter might have also used the word alpine to distinguish highland species from their lowland cousins, but the total numbers in each of these categories didn't differ strikingly between the 2 occasions. Using lizard in lieu of skink would be the least odd choice of phrasing. Who would say rodent when they meant lemming? But the variation in the skink numbers hardly seemed worth mentioning. That suggests that the data needs to be interpreted with a slightly different purpose in mind. We found that it was highly likely that Peter crossed between lowland and highland regions in all 4 quarters of his latest hike, but only made 2 such crossings during the previous hike. That in turn makes it likely that the trail was considerably steeper for the second hike. So our answer is calves. When his wife asked about the hike the next morning, Peter told her how much his calves were aching, since, although he was used to long walks like this, he'd spent the last 30 years growing accustomed to a gentler slope. That's correct, Zach replied. The applause from the Trentham supporters was decorous but emphatic, rising up in near-perfect synchrony, deafening for a moment, then falling away. Zach appeared crestfallen. His hope had been that the unembodied Serranos would make the connection between the altitudes implied by the sightings and the effects on the hike on an actual human body, and that they'd have no reason to mire their partners in unnecessary detail by mentioning anything but the animal numbers. But it appeared the collaboration was tighter than that. And even if the Serranos hadn't thought of aching calves all by themselves, the humans, who'd more easily from a visceral image of a hiker struggling up a rocky trail, had not been limited to an executive summary with a 2-dimensional map of the fauna's population counts. Matthew put the next question to West Ride. Start with a list of every possible 8-bit byte, from 0 to 255. Suppose you transform all the bytes in this list by the following method. You choose 8 bytes to use as masks, 1 for each bit of the new byte, and you set that bit to 1 or 0 depending on whether an odd or even number of bits in the original byte are equal to 1 in places where the mask is also 1. Depending on which masks you choose, this process might turn the original list into one where some of the bytes are missing and others are repeated. The question is, how many different ways can you choose the masks so that the new list is simply a reordering of the original, with nothing duplicated or omitted? Everyone on the team looked at each other. Maybe do it for 2 bits, then 3 bits, see if we can't find a pattern, Wahid proposed. Yes, Mira concurred. For 2 bits, there are 4 different bytes, But picking 00 for a mask would be crazy because it could never give you a 1 in that position. So you have 3 bytes to choose from for each mask. She quickly wrote out all 9 possibilities and tested them on the list of 4 bytes. She realized. You can't use the same mask more than once because that forces all the new bytes to have identical bits in 2 places, which means that the new list can never be complete. Wahid said, so for 2 bits, there are 6 choices, 3 for the first mask, then 2 for the second. And for the 3 bits, there ought to be 7 times 6 times 5, 210. Hang on, Vince interjected. I think that's just an upper limit. We know that repeating a mask would be bad, but it might not be the only way things can go wrong. What else can happen? Wahid asked, unconvinced, but willing to be persuaded. Vince wasn't sure, but he couldn't believe the problem could be so simple. He said, all this talk about bit masks is hiding something. There ought to be a clearer way to think about it. Like what? Zach pressed him, because it feels like we're stumbling around inside a computer in the dark. I don't know. Vince glanced at the clock. They had a little more than 3 minutes remaining. If the answer is just keeping the mask different, then there's no more work to do. But we need to check it if it holds for 3 bits. Wahid laughed. You want us to check 210 sets of masks? No, Vince conceded. Let me think. What if there's a bit that isn't 1 for any of the masks? Say we had 010, 100, 110. That's 3 different masks, but the last bit is always 0. That will turn the byte 001 to 000, but 000 also gets transformed into 000. So now it's duplicated. Okay, Wahid was dismayed, but then he rallied. So there's a stronger condition for each position. At least 1 mask needs to have a 1 there. We can still account for that, can't we? Mira said, wait, if we can have all zeros in any bit position, maybe we can't have repetitions either. The same pattern across all masks in 2 different places. What happens with a 4-bit mask set like... She wrote out 1100, 1101, 0010, 1111. These are all different masks, she said, and there's no position that's always 0, but because we have 1101 across the mask for both of the first 2 bits, this turns 1100 into 0000. Oh, there's a kind of symmetry there, Wahid said hopefully. Between the rows and columns of a matrix, Vince realized belatedly. All this crap about bit masks is just a way of talking about matrices. So where does that get us? Zach asked. Well, we need to count all of the 8x8 matrices whose entries are 0 or 1 and whose rows and columns aren't degenerate, like 2 vectors that are parallel or 3 vectors that lie in the same plane, because that wastes the chance to span 1 more dimension. But we need to do this in a space where the only coordinates are 0 and 1, and all arithmetic is modulo 2. Wahid wasn't giving up. For 3 bits, what if we say, there are 7 choices for the first row because we're avoiding 0, 6 choices for the second row because we're avoiding 0 in the first row, and then 4 choices for the third row because we're avoiding 0 in the first 2 rows, and the vector you get by adding the first 2 rows together because the sum of 2 vectors lies in the same plane. 7 times 6 times 4 is 168. Does that make sense? The buzzer rang. Vince stood up. I'm sorry, he said. We have no answer. Matthew walked over to the whiteboard and wrote a product of 8 terms, each equal to 2 to the 8th minus 2 to a power that ranged from 0 to 7. Vince didn't ask for the explanation. Matthew's answer just extended the pattern and Wahid's result for 3 bits. For each row, you needed to exclude the sum of any selection from the previous rows, including single rows or none at all. And there were 2 to the power of the row count such selections. They might have got there with a little more time. In the break, they debated whether they should rethink their strategy against Trentum. They'd come prepared with 10 questions, ready to make new choices from the list if necessary, and the failure of Zach's approach cast some of the rankings in a new light. But the 3 original selections still targeted different potential weak spots. I say we don't blink, Mira declared, and in the end, everyone agreed. Mira rose to her feet. A few years before the fall of the Berlin Wall, she said, an English journalist was imprisoned in East Germany. She was able to exchange letters with her husband, but they knew their mail was being read by authorities. Among the first things her husband sent her was a computer printout of a poem written by their 12-year-old daughter, which the journalist kept pinned to the wall of her prison cell. It read, "Evening light fades, quiet descends, the joking boy relaxed, sweetly amazed. Night promises peaceful dreams until morning." Historians studying the correspondence between the couple found that the words of this poem showed up in their letters far more often than would have been expected, and so might have played a part in the code they used. Once, in response to a letter where her husband used joking descends, quiet fades, and light in that order, the journalist responded by using evening, amazed, boy, 3 times, amazed, evening, joking, twice, relaxed, sweetly, amazed, sweetly, then relaxed. What was she communicating? Sybil and Matthew received the question with an air of perfect equanimity. Vince averted his gaze to avoid the temptation to stare at them and try to guess the kind of dialogue they were having with their Serranos. No one could have missed the poem is a pangram, Mira said quietly. Well, you think not, Vince replied. But then the question is, Zach began before Mira put a finger to her lips. When the buzzer rang, Matthew stood, frowning slightly. The problem is severely underdetermined, he declared. There are literally thousands of algorithms that would map both the husband's code words and the journalist to English plain text, using the daughter's poem as a shared resource. The algorithm with the lowest complexity yields 9 from the husband and egg lignin from the journalist. There are also protocols with more plausible exchanges, the simplest being cold, with the reply not very. But the computational power required to implement them might have been prohibitive, especially for the journalist. He waited politely for a response. Vince heard someone clear their throat out in the hall. Mira rose to her feet. The husband wasn't saying anything in his letter, she explained. He was providing a key that the journalist could use to help encode her own message. She took his numbers 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 by their position in the poem, with evening as 0 and the omitted, then used the dot matrix printout of the poem, with each letter of the alphabet forming a grid 5 dots wide to transform them into a number for each row, adding up those with a matching dot, leaving out the rest. The lowercase letters O and K provided her response. She was saying okay. Matthew turned to the adjudicators. With respect, could anyone really have guessed that? The question didn't even mention a dot matrix printer. Mira said, what do you think home computers used in the 1980s? The question mentioned a computer printout, not typed, not handwritten. The adjudicators conferred. Vince looked up at the vaulted ceiling. Had the question been fair? He believed so. And he certainly believed that an unaugmented human would have put themselves squarely in the shoes of the journalist from the start, thinking laterally about all the different ways the poem could be used rather than getting sidetracked by the search for ever more elaborate and impractical algorithms that fit their initial preconceptions. The chief adjudicator said, "We rule that no point be awarded by a 2-1 decision." The West Ride supporters went wild, while the rest of the hall remained silent. Mira beamed at her teammates ecstatically. Vince felt lightheaded. The floor seemed to be endlessly tilting, trying to sweep the team off stage, but never quite succeeding. The score is 1-1, the chief adjudicator declared before inviting Trentham to continue. Sybil rose to ask the second to last question of the match. A goldsmith is given a cube of solid gold. They are told to think of it as comprising 27 smaller cubic pieces and to remove 7 of them, the one in the center of the cube and the one in the center of each of its 6 faces. They are instructed to repeat this process for the remaining 20 smaller cubes and so on, until an ice cube the size of the original cube, with this pared down golden object frozen into it, would be light enough to float in water. Assume that the specific gravity of gold is exactly 19.28, and that of ice is 0.9168. Assume that the cube is large enough that the discrete atomic nature of matter does not come into play. But now suppose that, rather than dividing each cube precisely into equal thirds along each axis, the fractions used are f and then f again, then 1 minus 2f. The question is, by how much can f differ from 1/3 while ensuring that the top of the floating cube in equilibrium, in still water, slopes by no more than 1/100th of a degree? Vince felt as if he'd been smacked in the face with a cushion that had turned out to be a sandbag, which in turn had a lump of concrete at its core. Merely finding the point where the gold inlaid ice cube would float would have been the softest of questions, allowing this famous fractal construction, the Menger sponge, to be lopsided rendered everything far messier, though maybe not intractable, but having to solve a hydrostatic torque problem on top of that in order to quantify the actual lopsidedness. Mira said, 18 iterations until it floats, if f is exactly 1/3, but the specific gravity is about 0.9996, so we'll need to be careful. Vince shook himself out of his stupor and wrote down the version of the density formula where f was allowed to change. A tiny drop below 1/3 would see the 18th iteration of the cube sink, a further evil twist to the problem that he was in no mood to admire. Meanwhile, Wahid had been sketching water lines. These are the 3 ways the cube could break the surface of the water if one corner has the most weight, he said. The cross-section could be triangular, pentagonal, or rhombic, depending on the tilt and how much of the cube was submerged. I'm guessing we'll need the volume and center of mass of the displaced water for each case. Zach said, "Good idea. I'll shadow you." Vince left them to it and turned to Mira. "We'll do the center of mass for the cube itself?" She nodded, smiling slightly, maybe as terrified as he was by the moment of judgment barreling toward them, but determined to enjoy every remaining second nonetheless. "First, the gold alone, then add in the ice and combine them at the end?" she suggested. "Yes, that way the densities wouldn't appear at all until the last minute, letting them focus on the geometry." The center of mass of any rectangular block that appeared in the problem, even one with pieces removed in this lopsided fashion, should always lie on its main diagonal, running between the heaviest corner and the lightest. And at each level in the construction, the proportional distance along the diagonal to the center of mass should be the same for every block. So it ought to be possible to keep track of that singular number, C, starting from 1/2 for the tiniest blocks of solid gold, as they were assembled into ever more Byzantine fractal agglomerations. Vince added up the contributions from 20 suitably positioned blocks and stared at the result dismayed. The new value for C was a linear expression in the old C, but the coefficients were ratios between the cubic and quadratic polynomials in F. Since f was still an unknown that needed to wend its way through all of the subsequent calculations before its value could be found, applying this formula 18 times would render the whole exercise impossibly unwieldy. Mira examined what he'd written. "I get the same," she said. "I was hoping I'd screwed up. The real result was simpler," Vince confessed. "Oh, this can't be as bad as it looks," Mira insisted. "There has to be a shortcut a human can perform with pen and paper, or they'd be afraid the adjudicators would rule against them." "I could use an approximation that holds when f is close to 1/3, Vince suggested tentatively. "But we'd still have to iterate it 18 times, right?" Mira glanced at the clock. Vince didn't follow her gaze, but he knew they had no hope of doing anything 18 times. "And then, does it blow up or does it narrow down?" Mira wondered. "Because if it narrows..." Vince felt a surge of adrenaline, as if she just yanked him back from the edge of a pit. It must have a fixed point, he realized. For any f, there had to be a value of c that their updating formula left unchanged, and wherever they started from, each iteration ought to bring them closer to it. He solved for the fixed point. They'd just have to hope that after 18 iterations, the gap between this and the real value was too small to matter. Zach and Wahid had been looking on, waiting to report. Wahid said, "Well, the bad news is The cases where the top of the cube is partly underwater are horrendous. For such a small tilt, we might not need them. But if the whole thing is close to sinking, it's hard to be sure. Vince said, "Okay, let's see how far we get with the simplest case." As F was increased above 1/3, the cube became less dense and rose slightly higher in the water, even as it tilted. It hit the designated angle with the top of the cube still entirely above the waterline. But if you reduced F? The buzzer rang with the question unresolved, so Vince stood and offered what they had. The fraction F can increase by about 0.00028 before the cube tips by 1/100th of a degree, but we didn't have time to determine what happens when it decreases. Sybil said, "Your answer is correct as far as it goes. The amount by which F can decrease is about half as much." The adjudicators discussed the results among themselves. Then the chief adjudicator announced, "We've agreed, unanimously, to award half a point to West Ride." Vince took his seat, dazed, trying to make sense of the strange reprieve. A win was still possible, and so was a loss. Everything would be decided by the final question. "What do we ask now?" he wondered. "Stick to the plan," Zach counseled. They'd targeted awareness of the body and failed. They targeted empathy and succeeded. But having shown their hand, there was no point trying to repeat that victory. The break ended, and Vince rose to speak again. "You can take any ordinary sentence in English," he said, "and interpret it as a number by stripping out all spaces and punctuation, converting all letters to uppercase, and treating the decimal digits 0 to 9 and the letters A to Z as digits in base 36. For example, to be or not to be becomes a 13-digit number in base 36. Now consider a piece of text that manages to describe exactly the same number as its own base 36 interpretation. Its intended audience is someone who reads English and who knows all the details of the method I just gave to convert text into a number. But there are some restrictions. The text can't talk directly about itself. It can't just say, interpret this sentence as base 36. It can't be a single decimal digit, which would make the problem trivial, or something like 007 for the same reason. And although it can be terse and blunt, it can't use emojis or text tease. It can't omit spaces between words, and it can't assume that the reader will recognize and follow instructions in some programming language. What's the shortest string of characters, including spaces and punctuation marks, that satisfies all of these requirements? As Vince resumed his seat, Matthew and Sybil remained poker-faced. The problem he'd posed was related to Quines, computer programs whose output matched their own source code, but were forbidden to cheat by simply printing their own file. Some recreational code golfers sought the shortest possible Quines in their favorite programming languages, and the Serranos could easily have looked up the optimal example in any such language or found it for themselves. But in English, the rules were far less precise and the effects less predictable. The Serranos had absorbed terabytes of human-written text, but that was a poor basis on which to judge edge cases where the language became cramped and potentially cryptic. Vince suspected that each potential solution would need to be run past a human partner to verify that it really did meet all the conditions and would yield the required result. Mira caught his eye and mouthed something silently, but he couldn't make out the words. He returned a puzzled smile, but before she could repeat the message, the buzzer sounded. Sybil walked up to the whiteboard and wrote, X is period, sub X for dot base 36. Sub X for dot base 36. That's 57 characters, she said. The reader is told what X is, then performs the requested substitution, putting X in place of the full stop inside itself. That yields the original text without the quotation marks. But to interpret text in base 36 by the rules we're given, all punctuation marks are stripped away, so we end up exactly with the same number. Vince stood. That's beautiful, he conceded. It might take a few seconds thought to interpret, but I don't think the intended audience would find it ambiguous. He paused, then added, however, and approached the whiteboard. Sybil frowned but stood aside. Vince picked up a marker, and beneath her answer wrote the word base, the number 62, then 44 characters, a mixture of digits in both uppercase and lowercase letters. That's 52 characters, he said. When we interpret it in base 36, the lowercase letters become uppercase. But anyone who's been told about that convention would realize after a few seconds' thought that the base could also be increased to 62 by treating lowercase letters as 26 more digits. He turned to address Sybil. You accept that the third token here, interpreted as base 62, yields the same number as the base 36 interpretation of the full text? Yes, she replied. Her tone and demeanor were every bit as gracious as if he'd found something valuable she'd dropped in the street and held it up to her, muddy and soiled, asking if it was hers. The chief adjudicator said, Trentham, 1 point. West Ryde, 1.5. He kept talking, thanking and congratulating people, plugging the recordings of the earlier matches, but the supporters all but drowned out his words. The Trentham Student Council had laid out tea and scones for everyone at the rear of the hall. As Vince moved between the fold-up tables, he saw Wahid scrolling through an app on his phone. They're already pumping out the message that the wind says nothing about the real world, Wahid announced gloomily. Who cares about dot matrix codes from prison cells when you're looking for the most efficient employee? Fuck them, Vince replied. Have you seen the kind of questions people get asked at interviews? Yeah, fuck them, Wahid agreed. But I still want to know if I'll ever get hired. We put one scratch in the Serrano's paint job, but it's not all down to us. There'll be more. Vince turned and she and Zach were standing behind him. There ought to be some special glasses, Zach mused, surveying the small crowd around them, that show you all the Serranos standing beside their partners. Sybil approached the group. Could I talk to you for a moment? She asked Vince. Sure. She gestured that he should accompany her. Vince didn't want to be rude, so he followed, glancing back apologetically at his friends. When they reached an alcove at the side of the hall, she said, I've been asked to sound you out about a scholarship. Asked by whom? Hyperfine would provide you with a free AI collaborator and cover the fees to attend Trentham or another AI-friendly school. Vince was bemused. Don't people usually have their Serranos installed when they're about 5? Sybil winced at the vulgar nickname, but swallowed her distaste and replied, That's ideal, but people can adapt well into their teens. Honestly, I'm surprised that one close run-in quiz in Nowhereville is such a threat to the company's brand that they'd spend $1 million to neutralize it. It's also pretty insulting that the offer doesn't cover the whole team, but maybe trying to divide us is the whole point. Sybil smiled. It's not about any threat. Hyperfine recognizes potential wherever they spot it, and they don't want to see it go to waste. Nor do I, Vince replied, which is why I prefer to keep my skull free of chatter. It's not chatter, Sybil promised him. Her irises were green, but Vince could see a polychromatic shimmer slide across the dark pits of her pupils. And it's not like the incompetent tutors you're used to, or even the brightest human companion. We've taken sand from the beaches and deserts of the earth and melted it down and fashioned it into the substrate for a truly alien intelligence. That intelligence has consumed our own culture and history the way a larva consumes a leaf. And now it's growing into an entirely new form that will transcend. She stopped. Vince was laughing. I always thought that the Serranos were meant to be eloquent, he said, once he got control of himself. but seriously, you think you'll win anyone over with that kind of fifth-hand faux lyrical babble about intelligent sand? Oh, it sounds like you took it straight out of some drug-snorting venture capitalist podcast. You can mock us all you like, Sybil replied icily. But until you've formed a bond like I have, you'll never know how glorious it is. Well, maybe, Vince conceded, but from the outside, it's starting to look like your parents gave you a talking teddy bear with an internet connection and a lot of computing power to play with when you were young, that never got around to telling you that you needed to grow out of pretending it was real. As he walked back to his friends, the bus driver was already corralling everyone to leave. What was it you were trying to tell you for? Vince asked Mira, while the Trentham team was mesmerized by the search for the shortest English quine. She'd been mouthing, some kind of joke, some acerbic observation on the semantic tar pit they'd built for their opponents. I was telling you not to eat too many scones, Mira replied. I saw them bringing them out, so I wanted you to leave some room while we could all go for ice cream later. Vince suddenly recalled the scent of vanilla from his first trials with the Combre, but it had never been allocated to a specific experience. The slot remained free to be used however he wished. He said, ice cream to celebrate victory. That sounds good. Narrator's note. There were a lot of complex word problems in this, so I suggest if you'd like to follow along with all the proper equations, that you go back and read the text of the story. I did work with our author, Greg Egan, who simplified some of the paragraphs that had a lot of mathematical equations. So the text does differ from this narrated recording, and I just wanted to make you aware. Anyway, we have 3 more stories left for you for the month of October. I do hope you'll come back and listen should you so choose. And until then, my dear listener, I bid you a very fond and hopefully very temporary farewell.